I came home from a 7-month deployment in Afghanistan to find my wife sobbing at our kitchen table with a stack of certified letters spread out in front of her. And I knew immediately that something had gone very wrong while I was overseas. Grace looked up at me with red, swollen eyes, and for a moment she just stared like she couldn't believe I was actually standing there. I had managed to get emergency leave approved 3 weeks early after our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, called my unit's family support line. Grace didn't even know I was coming home yet. I dropped my duffel bag and crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, pulling her into my arms. "Jake," she whispered against my chest, her whole body shaking. "Jake, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to bother you while you were deployed, but they wouldn't stop. They just wouldn't stop." I held her tighter and looked down at the letters on the table. They were all from the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association in our subdivision outside Fort Campbell, Kentucky. We had bought this house just 8 months before my deployment, a nice 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet neighborhood that seemed perfect for starting our family. The HOA had seemed like a minor annoyance during the home buying process, nothing more than some rules about lawn care and paint colors. I picked up one of the letters and started reading. It was dated 3 weeks ago and addressed to Grace Lancaster, demanding immediate payment of $1,500 in fines for various violations. My jaw clenched as I scanned the list. Grass too long. Trash cans visible from the street on non-collection days. Unauthorized vehicle parked in driveway. Failure to respond to previous notices. Each violation carried a fine that had apparently been compounding with late fees. "Grace, what is all this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" She pulled back and wiped her eyes. "I tried to handle it myself. You were in a combat zone, Jake. What were you supposed to do from Afghanistan? I thought I could deal with it, but that woman, she just kept coming and coming. Every week there was something new. She would drive by the house multiple times a day looking for violations. She even came to the door and yelled at me when I was 8 months pregnant. My blood went cold. You were pregnant when she came to the door." Grace nodded. "I miscarried 2 weeks ago, Jake. The stress, the doctor said it might have been a contributing factor. I couldn't sleep. Every time I heard a car outside, I thought it was her coming back with another violation notice. I felt something break inside my chest. We had been so excited about the baby." Grace had told me over a grainy video call when I was at Bagram Airfield, and I had counted down the days until I could come home and be a father. Now that was gone, and some power-hungry HOA board member had contributed to my wife's suffering while I was halfway around the world unable to protect her. "Tell me everything," I said quietly. "From the beginning." Grace took a shaky breath and sat back down at the table. I pulled up a chair next to her and held her hand while she told me the whole story. It had started about 3 months into my deployment. Grace had gotten a notice about the grass being too long. She had hired a lawn service before I left, but they had apparently missed a week due to weather, and the HOA had immediately issued a violation. Grace paid the $50 fine and thought that was the end of it. But then there was another notice about the trash cans being visible from the street. Grace had put them out the night before collection like she always did, but according to the HOA rules, they could only be placed at the curb after 7 in the morning on collection day. Another $50 fine. Then there was a violation for having a commercial vehicle in the driveway. My brother had stopped by to check on Grace and help her with some household repairs. He drove a work truck with his construction company's logo on the side. He parked in our driveway for maybe 3 hours while he fixed a leaking faucet. Someone reported it to the HOA. $100 fine. Grace said she tried to go to an HOA board meeting to explain her situation. She told them her husband was deployed overseas. She was pregnant and dealing with morning sickness, and she was doing her best to maintain the property. She asked if there could be any leniency or if they could give her warnings instead of immediate fines. That was when she met Patricia Thornton, the HOA president. She looked me up and down like I was trash, Grace said, her voice trembling with anger now instead of just sadness. She said that military service was not an excuse for letting the neighborhood standards decline. She said that if we couldn't afford to maintain a home in Meadowbrook Heights, maybe we should have bought somewhere more appropriate for our income level. Jake, she said this in front of 20 other homeowners at the meeting. I was so humiliated. I felt my hands ball into fists. What else did she say? She said the HOA had rules for a reason and that everyone had to follow them equally, no exceptions. She said that my pregnancy was also not an excuse, and that if I was too delicate to handle homeownership, perhaps I should consider renting until I was more mature. She made it sound like I was some irresponsible teenager instead of a 28-year-old woman with a college degree and a career. Grace was a nurse at the local hospital. She had been working full-time up until a month before I came home, doing 12-hour shifts while pregnant and trying to maintain our house and deal with the constant harassment from the HOA. The woman was stronger than I was in a lot of ways, and hearing that someone had belittled her like that made me want to punch a wall. "Keep going," I said through gritted teeth. Grace told me that after the meeting, the violations had actually gotten worse. Patricia Thornton seemed to have made it her personal mission to find anything and everything wrong with our property. She cited us for having a wreath on the front door that was not in approved HOA colors. She said our mailbox was faded and needed repainting. She claimed there were weeds in our flower beds. Every single violation came with a fine, and the fines kept adding up. Grace tried to keep up with everything. She paid hundreds of dollars in fines. She spent her days off work pulling weeds and repainting the mailbox and making sure the trash cans were never visible and the grass was always exactly the right height. But it was never enough. Patricia always found something new. Then came the final straw. 3 weeks ago, Grace's car had broken down. It was parked in our driveway while she waited for the part to come in to get it fixed. Patricia issued a violation for having an inoperable vehicle on the property. The fine was $500, and the letter stated that if the vehicle was not removed within 48 hours, the fine would increase to $1,000, and the HOA would have it towed at our expense. I broke down, Grace admitted. I called her Jake. I begged her to give me a week to get the car fixed. I explained that I was pregnant and stressed, and that you were deployed and I was doing everything by myself. And you know what she said? I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. She said that I clearly couldn't handle adult responsibilities, and that maybe I should go back to living with my parents until my husband came home to take care of me. She said she was tired of dealing with me, and that if I contacted her personally again, instead of going through official HOA channels, she would file a restraining order against me for harassment. Grace's voice broke again. That was when I started having contractions. I was only 22 weeks pregnant, Jake. I drove myself to the hospital because I didn't want to call an ambulance and have another violation for emergency vehicles in the neighborhood. By the time I got there, I was bleeding. They tried to stop it, but it was too late. We lost the baby. I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at our quiet street. Somewhere a few houses down, Patricia Thornton was probably sitting in her perfect house with her perfect lawn, feeling satisfied with herself for keeping the neighborhood standards high. She had no idea that she had contributed to the loss of my child. She had no idea that her petty power trip had caused my wife weeks of suffering and stress. But she was going to find out. Where does she live? I asked quietly. Jake, no, Grace said, standing up quickly. I know what you're thinking. Don't do anything that will get you in trouble. You just got home. I don't want you to do something stupid because of this. I turned around and looked at her. Grace, I'm not going to hurt anyone, but I'm also not going to let this go. This woman tortured you while I was deployed. She contributed to you losing our baby. And she's apparently been violating fair housing laws and possibly the Service Members' Civil Relief Act in the process. I'm going to deal with this, but I'm going to do it the right way. Grace looked uncertain, but she nodded slowly. She lives at 1247 Oakmont Drive, the big two-story colonial with the fountain in the front yard. Of course she had a fountain. I should have guessed. I spent the rest of that day going through every single letter and notice the HOA had sent. I made copies of everything. I took photographs of our property from every angle, documenting that there were no current violations. The grass was immaculate. The trash cans were in the garage. Grace's car was now fixed and running perfectly. The mailbox looked brand new. Our flower beds were weed-free. There was literally nothing wrong with our property. Then I started researching. The Service Members' Civil Relief Act was a federal law that provided protections for active duty military members and their families. It included provisions about civil proceedings, evictions, and other legal matters. While it didn't specifically prohibit HOA fines, there were definitely questions about whether an HOA could aggressively pursue collection actions against a service member or their spouse during deployment, especially without providing proper notice and opportunities to remedy violations. I also looked into Kentucky state laws about HOAs. There were regulations about proper notice, reasonable fine amounts, and the requirement for HOAs to allow homeowners to attend hearings before imposing fines. From what Grace told me, most of these procedures had not been followed. She had been fined immediately for violations without being given any opportunity to fix them first. The next morning, I put on my class uniform. I made sure every ribbon was perfectly placed, my shoes were shined to a mirror finish, and my rank insignia was crisp and clear. I was a staff sergeant with 7 years of service, 2 combat deployments, and a chest full of decorations. I wanted Patricia Thornton to see exactly who she had been messing with. Grace tried one more time to talk me out of it. Jake, please, what if you make things worse? They can't get worse, honey, and I'm not going to threaten her or do anything illegal. I'm just going to have a conversation. Trust me. I drove the 6 blocks to Patricia Thornton's house and parked on the street. The house was exactly what I expected. Enormous, pristine, with professional landscaping and that ridiculous 3-tier fountain burbling away in the front yard. There were 2 luxury cars in the driveway, a Mercedes and a BMW. This woman clearly had money and time, which she apparently spent making life miserable for everyone around her. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. It played some elaborate chiming melody that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. After a moment, the door opened, and I found myself looking at a woman in her early 50s with carefully highlighted blonde hair, too much makeup, and an expression that immediately shifted from curiosity to disdain when she saw me standing there in uniform. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that made it clear she had no intention of helping me with anything. "Patricia Thornton?" I asked, keeping my voice polite and professional. "Yes, and you are?" Staff Sergeant Jake Kensington from 1742 Willow Creek Court. "I believe you've been in contact with my wife, Grace Lancaster, while I was deployed in Afghanistan." Her expression tightened. "If this is about the HOA fines, your wife has been properly notified through official channels." You can submit any disputes in writing to the HOA board within 30 days of receiving notice. Now, if you'll excuse me, she started to close the door, but I put my hand on it. Not forcefully, just enough to keep it from shutting. Madam, I'm not here to dispute the fines. I'm here to inform you that I've contacted a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes and military law. We'll be filing complaints with the Kentucky Real Estate Authority regarding the HOA's violation of proper notice and hearing procedures. We'll also be filing a federal complaint regarding potential violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Additionally, my lawyer believes we have grounds for a civil lawsuit for harassment and emotional distress. Patricia's face had gone pale and then flushed red. You can't threaten me. I have every right to enforce the HOA covenants. We have rules in this neighborhood. You have rules, I agreed, but you also have to follow the law when enforcing those rules. You fine my wife repeatedly without giving her reasonable opportunities to correct violations. You denied her requests for accommodation while I was deployed in a combat zone. You made disparaging comments about her pregnancy and our military service, and your harassment contributed to significant emotional distress that had medical consequences. I never harassed anyone, Patricia snapped. I simply enforced the standards that everyone in this neighborhood agreed to when they purchased their homes. If your wife couldn't handle that, it's not my problem. Actually, madam, it is your problem. Because now I'm home, and I'm going to make sure that everything you did gets reviewed by people who actually understand the law. You might be used to pushing around pregnant women whose husbands are deployed, but that game is over now. A man appeared behind Patricia, tall and balding with glasses. What's going on here? This is one of the homeowners from the neighborhood, Patricia said, her voice shrill. He's threatening me. I'm not threatening anyone, I said calmly. I'm informing Mrs. Thornton that we're pursuing legal action regarding the HOA's conduct while I was deployed. Are you Mr. Thornton? Yes, I'm Richard Thornton. Look, if you have a dispute with the HOA, there are proper channels for that. You can't just show up at our house. With respect, sir, your wife showed up at my house to harass my pregnant wife while I was deployed. I'm simply returning the favor by notifying her in person that her actions have consequences. You'll be receiving official legal documents soon. Have a good day. I turned and walked back to my truck, my heart pounding. I could hear Patricia's raised voice behind me, but I didn't look back. I had said what I needed to say, and now it was time to actually follow through. The lawyer I had contacted was named Michael Brennan, a retired Army JAG officer who now specialized in military legal issues and HOA disputes in the Fort Campbell area. I had found him through a quick internet search the night before, and his reviews were excellent. I met with him that afternoon and brought all of the documentation I had compiled. Michael was in his 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed. He spent over an hour reviewing everything I had brought and asking questions about the timeline and Grace's interactions with the HOA. Finally, he sat back in his chair and nodded. "You've got a strong case," he said. The HOA violated multiple procedural requirements under Kentucky law. They're supposed to provide written notice of a violation and give the homeowner a reasonable opportunity to correct it before imposing fines. Based on what you've shown me, they were issuing fines immediately or with very short correction periods. That's not legal. What about the military angle? I asked. The Service Members Civil Relief Act doesn't specifically address HOA fines, but there's a good argument that aggressively pursuing collection actions against a service member's spouse during deployment violates the spirit of the law. At minimum, it shows a pattern of conduct that demonstrates a lack of good faith. Combined with the harassment and discriminatory comments about your wife's pregnancy, we can build a case for intentional infliction of emotional distress. What are our options? Michael leaned forward. We can file a complaint with the Kentucky Real Estate Authority. They regulate HOAs in the state and can investigate violations of HOA law. We can also file a civil lawsuit seeking damages for harassment, emotional distress, and possibly the medical expenses related to your wife's miscarriage. That one would be harder to prove causation, but it's worth including. And we can file a formal dispute of all the fines with the HOA and demand a hearing before an independent arbitrator. I want to do all of it, I said. This woman needs to understand that she can't treat people this way. Michael nodded. All right. I'll need a retainer of $2,000 to get started. I'll draft the complaint for the Real Estate Authority first, since that's free and will put pressure on the HOA immediately. Then we'll file the civil suit. In the meantime, I want you and your wife to document everything. If anyone from the HOA contacts you, write it down. If you see Patricia Thornton driving by your house, note the date and time. We're building a harassment case and documentation is key. I wrote him a check on the spot. It was a lot of money, but it was worth every penny if it meant Grace could finally have some peace. Over the next week, things got interesting. Michael filed the complaint with the Real Estate Authority, which apparently prompted an immediate investigation. An inspector came out to the neighborhood and reviewed the HOA's records, including all of the violations they had issued over the past year. It turned out Grace and I weren't the only ones who had been targeted. Patricia Thornton had issued over 200 violations in the past 12 months, which was more than twice the average for HOAs of similar size. The inspector also found that the HOA had been failing to follow proper procedures for most of those violations. They were issuing immediate fines without proper notice or opportunities to correct. They were charging late fees that exceeded the amounts allowed by law, and they had never properly registered their fine schedule with the state, which meant technically all of their fines were invalid. I learned all of this from Michael, who got regular updates from the Real Estate Authority investigator. Meanwhile, word had apparently spread through the neighborhood about the investigation. I started getting visits from neighbors I had never met before. The first was a man named Thomas Reed who lived 2 streets over. He came by on a Tuesday evening and introduced himself nervously at the door. I heard you filed a complaint about Patricia Thornton and the HOA board, he said. I wanted to thank you. She's been making my life hell for 2 years. I got fined $500 because my daughter left a bicycle on the front lawn overnight. A child's bicycle. One night. I invited him in, and he told me his story. It was remarkably similar to ours. Patricia had targeted him with a series of increasingly petty violations, until he had paid over $3,000 in fines. He had wanted to fight back, but he was a single father with 2 kids, and didn't have the time or money to take on the HOA. If there's anything I can do to help your case, let me know, he said. I kept all the letters. I took pictures. I documented everything because I knew it wasn't right. I just didn't know what to do about it. The next visitor was an elderly woman named Dorothy Chen. She lived across the street from us, and I had seen her working in her garden but never really talked to her. She brought over a pie and a folder full of documents. I got fined for having the wrong color roses in my front garden, she said, her voice shaking with anger. I've been a gardener for 40 years. I've won awards for my roses, and that woman told me they were not in compliance with the HOA landscaping guidelines and I had to remove them. When I refused, she fined me $1,000 and threatened to put a lien on my house. By the end of the week, I had collected statements and documentation from 12 different homeowners who had been targeted by Patricia Thornton. The pattern was clear. She went after people who she perceived as vulnerable or unable to fight back. Single parents, elderly residents, military families with deployed service members, people who were new to the neighborhood and didn't know their rights. Michael was delighted with the additional evidence. This is exactly what we needed. It shows a pattern of abuse of authority. The real estate authority is going to come down hard on this HOA board. He was right. 2 weeks after the initial complaint, the Kentucky Real Estate Authority issued a formal finding that the Meadowbrook Heights HOA had violated multiple state regulations. They issued a cease and desist order prohibiting the HOA from collecting any of the disputed fines until proper procedures were followed. They also required the HOA board to undergo mandatory training on proper HOA governance and to hire an independent management company to review all of their policies and procedures. But that wasn't all. The Real Estate Authority investigator had found something else during his review: financial irregularities. Patricia Thornton had been collecting fines and depositing them into the HOA account, but the amounts didn't match up. Over the past 2 years, nearly $30,000 in fines had gone missing. The investigator referred the case to the Kentucky State Police for potential embezzlement charges. I found out about this on a Saturday morning when 2 state police detectives showed up at my door, asking questions about my interactions with the HOA. I told them everything I knew and gave them copies of all the documents I had. They were professional and thorough, and they told me that they were investigating multiple complaints about Patricia Thornton and the HOA board's financial management. Did she really steal $30,000? I asked. One of the detectives, a woman named Sandra Yates, nodded grimly. We're still tracing all the transactions, but it looks like she was pocketing a portion of the fine money and using it for personal expenses. She thought no one would notice because most people just paid the fines without questioning them. But once we started digging into the records, it became obvious. There are cash withdrawals from the HOA account that have no corresponding expenses or documentation. What happens now? I asked. We'll finish the investigation and present our findings to the county prosecutor. Based on what we've found so far, I expect there will be criminal charges. Embezzlement, fraud, possibly other charges related to her conduct as HOA president. Grace had been listening from the kitchen, and when the detectives left, she came over and hugged me tightly. I can't believe this is really happening. I thought we were just going to fight the fines. I never imagined she was actually stealing money. Power corrupts, I said. She had complete control over the HOA and nobody questioned her. She probably started small, just taking a little bit here and there, and then it escalated. People like her always think they're too smart to get caught. The neighborhood was buzzing with gossip over the next few days. Everyone had heard about the police investigation. There was an emergency HOA meeting called to discuss the situation, and nearly every homeowner in the subdivision showed up. Grace and I went together, and I wore my uniform again. I wanted everyone to know who we were and what we had been through. The meeting was chaos. The remaining members of the HOA board, 3 people who had apparently been rubber stamping whatever Patricia wanted, tried to maintain order but were shouted down by angry homeowners demanding answers. Where had their HOA dues gone? Why had Patricia been allowed to issue so many fines without oversight? What was being done to fix the situation? Patricia herself was not at the meeting. According to her husband Richard, who did attend, She was at home on the advice of her lawyer and would not be making any public statements while under investigation. Richard himself looked haggard and defeated. He stood up at one point and tried to defend his wife, saying that she had been trying to maintain neighborhood standards and had made some procedural mistakes, but had never intended to hurt anyone. Thomas Reed stood up and cut him off. "Your wife told me I was a bad parent because my daughter left a toy outside. She made my 10-year-old cry. Don't stand there and tell us she was just trying to help the neighborhood." Dorothy Chen stood up next. "She told me my roses were ugly and had to be destroyed. She tried to ruin something I've spent decades building. That's not a procedural mistake, that's cruelty." Then Grace stood up. I hadn't known she was going to speak, and I felt a surge of pride as she stepped forward. She was shaking, but her voice was clear and strong. "Patricia Thornton harassed me for months while my husband was deployed in Afghanistan. She targeted me because she knew I was vulnerable and alone. She made my life so stressful that I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I was terrified every day that I would come home to another violation notice. And when I lost my baby, she didn't care. She didn't even acknowledge it. She just kept sending more letters and more fines." Grace's voice broke, but she kept going. "I don't care if she goes to jail for stealing money. I care that she destroyed my sense of safety in my own home. I care that she took away what should have been a happy time in my life and turned it into a nightmare. And I care that she's done the same thing to so many other people in this neighborhood. She needs to be held accountable, and the rest of the board needs to take responsibility for letting her get away with it for so long." The room erupted in applause. Grace sat down next to me, and I took her hand. She was crying, but she was also stronger than I had ever seen her. The HOA board held a vote that night and unanimously removed Patricia Thornton as president. They also voted to refund all fines that had been issued in the past 2 years and to void any liens or collection actions that were pending. They hired an independent management company to take over HOA operations and review all policies and procedures. It was a complete overhaul, and it was long overdue. But the best part came 2 weeks later. I was home working on some repairs in the garage when a police car pulled up in front of Patricia Thornton's house. I watched as the same 2 state police detectives who had interviewed me walked up to her door. Patricia answered, and after a brief conversation, the detectives placed her in handcuffs and led her to the police car. She had been arrested. I called Michael Brennan immediately. He had already heard. "They're charging her with 15 counts of felony theft by deception and 5 counts of fraudulent use of HOA funds. If she's convicted on all counts, she could be looking at 10 to 20 years in prison." "Good," I said, and I meant it. The arrest made the local news. The story was picked up by the Clarksville Leaf-Chronicle and even got a mention in the Nashville News. "Local HOA president arrested for embezzlement" was the headline. The story detailed the investigation, the missing money, and the pattern of harassment and illegal fining practices. Patricia's smug face was plastered all over the internet, and the comments sections were brutal. People shared their own HOA horror stories and celebrated seeing someone finally held accountable. Richard Thornton filed for divorce 3 days after his wife's arrest. According to neighborhood gossip, he claimed he had no idea what she had been doing and wanted to protect his assets. I felt a little bit sorry for him, but not much. He had been living in that house and benefiting from the money his wife was stealing. It was hard to believe he was completely innocent. The criminal case moved forward over the next several months. Patricia's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was not interested in going easy on her. There was too much evidence, too many victims, and too much public attention on the case. They wanted to make an example of her. The trial was scheduled for August, 6 months after I had first knocked on Patricia Thornton's door. Grace and I were both called as witnesses. I testified about the pattern of harassment and the impact it had on Grace while I was deployed. Grace testified about the stress, the miscarriage, and the fear she had lived with for months. Thomas Reed testified about being targeted as a single father. Dorothy Chen testified about her roses and the $1,000 fine. But the most damning testimony came from the forensic accountant who had reviewed the HOA's financial records. She laid out in meticulous detail how Patricia had been skimming money from the HOA account for over 2 years. She had started small, just a few $100s here and there. But over time, she had gotten bolder. She was withdrawing thousands of dollars at a time and using it for personal expenses. Luxury vacations, designer clothes, expensive jewelry. She had stolen nearly $40,000 in total. Once all of the transactions were tracked down, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. He called Patricia's conduct a betrayal of the trust placed in her by her community, and noted that she had abused her position of authority to enrich herself while making life miserable for vulnerable homeowners. He sentenced her to 12 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA and to individual homeowners who had been affected by her conduct. Patricia Thornton was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I never saw her again. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA underwent a complete transformation after Patricia's arrest. The new board, which included Thomas Reed and Dorothy Chen, rewrote the covenants and bylaws to include strong protections against harassment and abuse. They established clear procedures for violations that required warnings and opportunities to correct before any fines could be issued. They capped fines at reasonable amounts and prohibited late fees from exceeding the original fine amount. And they required regular independent audits of the HOA's finances to prevent any future embezzlement. More importantly, the new board made it clear that the HOA was there to support the community, not to police it. They organized neighborhood events like block parties and holiday celebrations. They set up a volunteer committee to help elderly residents and military families with lawn care and home maintenance. They created a welcoming environment instead of a hostile one. Grace and I settled into our home and our life together. The stress and trauma of what we had been through took time to heal, but we worked through it together. Grace went back to work at the hospital and threw herself into her nursing career. I transitioned out of active duty and got a job with a defense contractor, which meant I could stay home and didn't have to deploy anymore. We tried again for a baby, and this time it worked. Grace got pregnant a year after Patricia's trial, and 9 months later, our daughter Jenna was born. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I thought about everything we had been through to get to that moment. The deployment, the harassment, the miscarriage, the investigation and trial. It had all been worth it to get here. Our neighbors threw us a baby shower in the community clubhouse. Dorothy brought a beautiful handmade baby blanket. Thomas's daughters made a welcome sign and hung it on our front door. Even people we barely knew stopped by with gifts and congratulations. It was the kind of community support that should have been there all along, and it felt good to finally have it. I saw Richard Thornton once more, about 6 months after Patricia went to prison. He had moved out of the big house with the fountain and into a small condo on the other side of town. I ran into him at a grocery store, and he looked like he had aged 10 years. He saw me and hesitated like he wasn't sure whether to say anything. Finally, he approached me. "Jake, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything Patricia put you and your wife through." I knew she was stressed about the HOA and focused on the rules, but I didn't realize how far she had gone until everything came out. I should have paid more attention. I should have stopped her. I looked at him for a moment. He seemed genuinely remorseful, and I believed him. "Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it." He nodded and walked away. I never saw him again after that. Life in Meadowbrook Heights became what it should have been from the beginning, peaceful. Our lawn was well maintained because we wanted it to be, not because we were afraid of fines. Our neighbors were friends, not adversaries. The HOA sent out occasional reminders about community standards, but they were polite and reasonable, and they always offered to help if someone was struggling to keep up with maintenance. Grace and I talked sometimes about selling the house and moving somewhere without an HOA, but we decided to stay. This was our home. We had fought for it, and we had won. Patricia Thornton had tried to drive us out, but instead, she was the one who was gone. We were not going to let her take anything else from us. I kept in touch with Michael Brennan, the lawyer who had helped us through everything. He told me that our case had led to changes in Kentucky HOA law. The state legislature had passed new regulations requiring HOAs to follow strict procedures before imposing fines and limiting the amounts that could be charged. They had also increased oversight of HOA finances and made it easier for homeowners to challenge unfair practices. Our fight had made a difference not just for our neighborhood, but for people across the state. Jenna grew into a happy, healthy toddler. She loved playing in our backyard, and Grace and I would sit on the porch and watch her run around in the grass. Sometimes I thought about how different things could have been. If Grace had been just a little less strong, if I hadn't gotten emergency leave, if we hadn't decided to fight back, Patricia Thornton might still be out there terrorizing homeowners and stealing their money. But we had fought back, and we had won. Justice had been served, and our family was safe and happy. One evening, about 3 years after everything had happened, Grace and I were sitting on the porch after putting Jenna to bed. It was a warm summer night, and the neighborhood was quiet except for crickets and the occasional distant sound of kids playing. Grace leaned her head on my shoulder, and I put my arm around her. "You ever think about what you would say to Patricia if you saw her again?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. "No, I don't think about her at all anymore. She doesn't deserve any more of our time or energy." Grace smiled. "Good answer. What about you? Do you think about her?" "Sometimes. Usually when I'm having a bad day or feeling stressed about something. But then I look at Jenna, and I look at our home, and I remember that we won. She tried to break us, but we're stronger than ever. That's the best revenge." She was right. We had built a good life in spite of everything Patricia Thornton had done to try to destroy it. We had a beautiful daughter, a home we loved, and a community that supported us. Patricia was in prison, alone and disgraced, having lost everything because of her own greed and cruelty. We never spoke her name again. The years passed quietly after that. I advanced in my career with the defense contractor, and eventually became a project manager overseeing training programs for military units. Grace was promoted to charge nurse in the emergency department at the hospital. Jenna started kindergarten at the local elementary school and made friends quickly. She was outgoing and confident, qualities I hoped she had inherited from both of us. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA continued to function smoothly under its new leadership. Thomas Reed became president and did an excellent job of maintaining community standards while treating everyone with respect and dignity. Dorothy Chen organized a neighborhood gardening club that won awards for their community beautification projects. The fountain at the old Thornton house, which had been bought by a nice young couple with twins, was removed and replaced with a simple, elegant garden. Sometimes new residents would move in and ask about the HOA, nervous about rules and fines. The long-time residents would assure them that things were different now, that the HOA was there to help, not to harass. And if anyone pushed for details about what had happened, someone would inevitably mention the Patricia Thornton case as a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked. I testified one more time related to the case, at a civil proceeding where several homeowners, including us, sued Patricia for damages. The judge awarded us a settlement, though we knew we would probably never see most of the money. Patricia had declared bankruptcy from prison, and whatever assets she had left had already been seized for restitution. But it was about the principle. It was about having a legal record that what she did was wrong and that she had harmed real people in real ways. Grace framed the judgment and hung it in our home office, not as a trophy but as a reminder that standing up for yourself matters, that fighting back against injustice is worth it, even when it is hard and scary. That systems only change when people refuse to accept the status quo. We taught those lessons to Jenna as she grew up. We told her age-appropriate versions of what had happened with the HOA, emphasizing that sometimes people abuse power and that it is important to speak up when you see something wrong. We taught her to be strong and confident, to know her rights, and never to let anyone make her feel small or powerless. By the time Jenna was in 3rd grade, the story of Patricia Thornton had become almost legendary in our neighborhood. New kids at school would ask Jenna if it was true that her dad had sent an evil HOA president to prison. She would roll her eyes and explain that it was more complicated than that, but yes, basically that had happened. She was proud of us, and we were proud of her. I stayed in touch with some of the other homeowners who had been affected by Patricia's harassment. Thomas Reed's daughters grew up and went to college. He told me once that standing up to Patricia and serving on the HOA board had given him confidence he never knew he had. Dorothy Chen won a statewide gardening award and donated the prize money to a fund the HOA had established to help residents who were struggling financially with home maintenance. The military community at Fort Campbell heard about our case, and I was asked to speak at a few family readiness group meetings about legal protections for military families. I talked about the Service Members Civil Relief Act and about the importance of documenting everything when you are dealing with difficult situations during a deployment. I always emphasized that Grace was the real hero of our story, not me. She was the one who had endured months of harassment and stress. I had just come home and helped finish what she had started. Grace always blushed when I said things like that, but I meant every word. She was the strongest person I knew, and I was grateful every day that she was my wife and the mother of our child. As the years continued to roll by, the physical reminders of Patricia Thornton's reign of terror faded away. The mountains of violation letters were eventually shredded. The legal documents were filed away in boxes in the attic. The stress and fear became distant memories, replaced by happy times and new experiences. But we never forgot the lessons we learned. We stayed active in the HOA and made sure that new board members understood the importance of treating homeowners fairly and following proper procedures. We voted in every HOA election and encouraged our neighbors to do the same. We believed that the best way to prevent another Patricia Thornton was to stay engaged and vigilant. I checked on Patricia's status occasionally through the Kentucky Department of Corrections website. She was housed at the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women in Pewee Valley, serving her 12-year sentence. Her earliest possible release date was listed as 2033, which meant she would be in her mid-60s when she got out. I felt no sympathy for her. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. When Jenna was 10 years old, she had to do a school project about someone who had shown courage. She chose to write about Grace. She interviewed her mom, asking about the experience with the HOA and how Grace had kept going even when things were scary and overwhelming. Grace cried while answering the questions, but they were good tears. Healing tears. Jenna's project won first place in her class. The teacher made a point of telling us at parent-teacher conferences how impressed she was with the story and with how Jenna had presented it. "You've raised a remarkable young woman," she said. "She has a strong sense of justice and a clear understanding of right and wrong." Grace and I left that conference holding hands, feeling proud and grateful. We had been through hell, but we had come out the other side stronger. Our daughter was growing up with values and principles that would serve her well in life. Our community was better because we had refused to be silent. And Patricia Thornton was exactly where she deserved to be. Life was good. On the 10th anniversary of the day I had come home early from deployment and found Grace crying at the kitchen table, we decided to have a small celebration. Not to celebrate the trauma, but to celebrate surviving it and thriving in spite of it. We invited some of our closest friends and neighbors over for a backyard barbecue. Thomas Reed came with his daughters, who were now young adults. Dorothy Chen brought flowers from her garden. Other neighbors brought food and drinks and stories. We sat around the fire pit that evening, watching Jenna and Thomas's younger daughter roast marshmallows and laughing at old stories. Someone brought up the Patricia Thornton saga, and we all shared our memories of that crazy time. But we talked about it with humor and perspective now, not with anger or pain. It was a thing that had happened, a challenge we had overcome, a story with a satisfying ending. To second chances, Thomas said, raising his beer, and to good neighbors who have your back. We all raised our glasses and echoed the toast. To second chances. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Jenna was asleep, Grace and I sat together on the porch swing. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, safe. Everything we had fought for. "You have any regrets?" Grace asked softly. "About how we handled everything." I thought about it carefully. "No, we did what we had to do. We stood up for ourselves and for other people who were being hurt. We made sure there were consequences for someone who abused their power. And we made things better for everyone in this community. I wouldn't change any of it." Grace nodded. "Me neither. It was hard, but it was worth it." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, rocking gently on the swing. The past was behind us. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility and promise. And the present, right here in this moment, was exactly where we wanted to be. We had survived Patricia Thornton's reign of terror. We had fought back and won. We had built a life and raised a daughter and created a home in a community that valued kindness and fairness. And Patricia Thornton, wherever she was in that prison cell, would have to live with the knowledge that she had lost everything while we had gained everything. Her attempts to break us had only made us stronger. Her cruelty had backfired spectacularly. She had become a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when power corrupts and when no one stands up to say enough. We had said enough, and we had won. As I sat there with Grace's head on my shoulder, listening to the crickets and feeling the warm breeze, I thought about all the deployed service members out there who were counting on their communities to treat their families fairly while they were gone. I thought about all the homeowners who were being bullied by petty tyrants on HOA boards. I thought about all the people who were afraid to stand up because they didn't think they could win. Our story proved that you could win. It proved that justice was possible. It proved that doing the right thing mattered. I hope that someone somewhere would hear our story and find the courage to stand up for themselves, to refuse to be a victim, to fight back against injustice, no matter how powerful the opponent seemed, because if we could do it, anyone could. Grace squeezed my hand. "What are you thinking about?" "Just about how lucky I am," I said honestly. "To have you, to have Jenna, to have this life, all of it." "We're lucky to have you too," she said. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come home when you did. If you hadn't believed me and fought for us." "I'll always fight for us," I promised. "Always." And I meant it. Whatever challenges life threw at us, we would face them together. We were a team, a partnership, a family. Nothing and no one could break that. Not even Patricia Thornton had been able to destroy what we had, and she had certainly tried. But we were still here, still standing, still strong, and she never spoke to us again. None of them did. The old guard of the HOA board, the people who had enabled Patricia's behavior, had all quietly resigned or been voted out. They avoided us at the grocery store and took different routes to avoid driving past our house. They were ashamed, as they should have been. They had stood by while Patricia terrorized the neighborhood, and now they had to live with that knowledge. But we didn't hold grudges. We focused on building something better, on creating the kind of community we wanted to live in. The kind of place where people looked out for each other instead of looking for violations, where neighbors helped each other instead of fining each other, where fairness and kindness mattered more than arbitrary rules. That was Patricia Thornton's legacy, though not the one she had intended. She had wanted to be remembered as the woman who maintained standards and kept property values high. Instead, she was remembered as a criminal, a bully, and a cautionary tale. Her name became synonymous with everything wrong with HOA governance. And our names became associated with standing up for what was right, with refusing to be victims, with making change happen. I was proud of that legacy. I was proud of Grace for enduring so much and staying strong. I was proud of our neighbors who had come forward with their stories. I was proud of the new HOA board for doing the hard work of rebuilding trust. And I was proud of our little family for coming through everything intact and happy. The journey from that terrible day when I came home to find Grace crying to this peaceful evening on the porch had been long and difficult, but every step had been worth it. Every confrontation, every legal filing, every testimony, every moment of fear and uncertainty had led us here. To safety. To peace. To justice. Patricia Thornton had threatened my wife while I was deployed. She had made Grace's life a living hell. She had contributed to the loss of our first child. She had stolen money and abused her power and hurt countless people. But in the end, she had lost everything. And we had won. The stars came out above us, bright and clear in the Kentucky sky. Somewhere in the house, I could hear Jenna talking in her sleep, probably having some adventure in her dreams. Grace's breathing slowed and steadied as she dozed off against my shoulder. The neighborhood settled into nighttime quiet. I stayed on that porch swing for a long time, just holding my wife and thinking about everything we had been through, about the deployment and the homecoming, about the violations and the harassment, about the investigation and the trial, about the victory and the vindication, about the years of healing and rebuilding, about the life we had created in spite of everything. It had all been worth it. Every single moment had been worth it to get here. And tomorrow, when the sun came up, we would wake up in our home, in our neighborhood, in our community, and we would live our lives without fear, without looking over our shoulders for violation notices, without worrying about petty tyrants with too much power and too little oversight. We were free, we were safe, we were home, and Patricia Thornton would never threaten anyone again. That was worth everything.